Thank you, Mr. Royce.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gensler, as to the application of the CFTC proposed rules to foreign counterparties and to foreign dealers, I was going to ask you about a concern here over regulatory arbitrage and over the fact also that they're going to wait this out. You implement your policies here. We see more and more derivatives business go to Europe. And at the end of the day, we have American financial companies severely disadvantaged vis-a-vis their foreign competitors. I mentioned in my opening statement that in the long run, onerous rules that are unnecessary will without doubt drive capital to non-U.S. markets. And you've testified here that you're in contact with regulators in Europe. You expect them to follow the American approach, but how do you have those concrete assurances? Do we have a memorandum of understanding with European regulators? Tell me how you assure us of that fact.
We're working very closely. All three of our agencies are working very closely with the Europeans and Asian regulators. We actually share our pre-proposal documents, memos, and drafts with them. I think, depending upon budgets, I guess, but I'll be back over in Europe in March in front of the European Parliament, possibly. So we're working very closely. Their proposals, I'm optimistic, are quite consistent on clearing, this end-user approach, swap data repositories, the dealer regimes. They are a little bit time-wise behind us, a little later than us.
Yeah, they're going to be later, and I don't know where Brazil and Toronto and Singapore are going to be here, but I think it's going to be very hard to try to convince us that American firms are not going to lose business to European competitors when that's already happening now. Let me ask you another question, and that has to do with the fact I know today the SEC and the CFTC, you're saying they're trying desperately to get this collaborative environment. But on the most important rules, you're failing to get that kind of collaboration between the two agencies. And the differences in the derivatives markets you oversee are virtually non-existent. I mean, there's a lot of overlap there in products and users. And the fact is that you insist on producing two very different sets of regulations here. And if this is the end result, end users and investors are not going to be better off. It's going to be a boon for foreign companies. And I'll just give you a few of the, in terms of what's discussed in the business press, real-time reporting, where the agencies have different rules for the definition of what real-time means, block trade definition and reporting time for block trades, the number of data fields that must be reported is different, which entity is tasked with submitting trade information to the public, all different. Second, we've got the block trade definition, where the SEC wisely asks for further public comment and will likely embrace different definitions depending on asset class and liquidity, whereas the CFTC has offered a rigid, one-size-fits-all approach that many argue is overly restrictive. And then third, we have the swap execution facility rules, where the CFTC requires sending a request for a quote to at least 5 liquidity providers. The SEC takes, I think, a more reasonable approach here in allowing the customers to choose how many liquidity providers it requests quotes from. But the bottom line is, it's different in every case. And I'd like your comment on that as well, if you could.
I'm happy to comment on that, Congressman. I'd say a couple of things. One is that we are working very closely together, and there are many more things that are the same than that are different, although you have pointed out, I think, some important differences.
I picked out some of 50 that in the business press have been pointed out.
Where
they differ.
We are still at the proposal stage, so there's lots of opportunity through the comment process and through our extensive meetings with industry and others to bring these rules closer together. And when we propose something, for example, that's different than the CFTC, we actually ask people what would be a better approach. Is the CFTC's approach a better, more realistic approach, or is the SEC approach better, or is there yet a third way to go about dealing with this? I would say also that there is some differences in the markets that we are regulating. The security-based swap markets, which really just represents about 5% of the notional value of the swaps markets, trade quite differently than the interest rate markets do, for example. And so to some extent, the differences in the marketplace will dictate some things that are different. But let me please agree with you, though, that where our rules are going to fall upon institutions that are contracting and working in both markets, it really is incumbent upon us to make them as close to identical as possible so that institutions aren't put under the burden of two separate sets of rules. Where the rules go to, for example, differences in the way orders might interact within the marketplace, there might be some justification for slightly different rules because of the nature of the products that are being traded.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have questions for the record without objection on position limits, which were meant to curtail speculation, but could end up hitting long-term passive investors. I meant to ask that question, but I'll put that in the record and then get the response from the witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Royce. Ms.